In this part, we're going to look at the development of the French Revolution and its dramatic shift from a moderate revolution to a radical revolution. And we saw in the last segment of the lecture that one of the key factors in that was the success of the one group of the Jacobins, the Mountain, who advocated for executing King Louis XVI, in part because they saw him as a traitor. And that's actually what you see in the picture on the top right there, is the execution of the king in what had been a sort of royal plaza, and it's renamed sort of a national plaza. One of the problems that the French Revolution faced is that many of its reforms that began in this beginning of this more radical process, particularly beginning around 1792, many of the reforms, such as selling the church lands, angered the church, obviously the royal family, the nobility, and so many of them had fled the country to more conservative areas, especially Austria. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why Austria ends up going to war against France. Prussia joined with Austria. Nobles who had been in the military on the side of France, initially many of them left and joined the Austrians in trying to defeat the revolution. And the National Assembly then found it very hard to raise an experienced army, and they feared that the revolution would be defeated from without, and then they started worrying about it being defeated from within, from disgruntled individuals. So as this war continues and more countries are allying against France, what happens is that the revolutionary government basically goes into a state of emergency to raise money and men for the army. This means that they had to set up a national draft, and they also needed to make sure that they silenced any counter-revolutionaries. This is a process often referred to as the Terror, this period of the French Revolution, and it was spearheaded by one Maximilien Robespierre. And so he was part of, or instrumental in, establishing the Committee for Public Safety. This is a part of the centralized government. It is a 12-member committee led by Maximilien Robespierre, who you see in the bottom right there, which basically began to direct the whole government. It set up paramilitary units to hunt down and hunt out dissenters. Tribunals were set up to try political suspects, and you were either found guilty or not. And if you were found guilty, you were guillotined, which is what happened to Louis up there as well in your top picture. By the way, the guillotine is one of the symbols always associated with the French Revolution, and ironically, it was an Enlightenment idea that created the guillotine, because the guillotine was created in part to speed up the execution of individuals so that it wouldn't be gruesome, such as drawing and quartering or hanging. And the idea was it was quick and not necessarily painless, but quick, and they're dead very, very quickly. But it also was very efficient, which became important for the Terror because many are executed during this period. Robespierre himself said, as you've read in a document by him, that he was in favor of democracy, but that this terror, the idea of the Committee for Public Safety and rooting out enemies of the revolution, was necessary in a time of war to teach virtues. And what happens during this time is a whole series of laws are passed looking for individuals who could cause any trouble. And so, like a witch hunt, people were carefully monitored. Any behavior that might be considered anti-revolutionary was cause for suspicion. If you questioned the policies of the revolution, if you questioned the Committee for Public Safety, if you questioned Robespierre, you could come under suspicion as being an enemy of the revolution, simply for voicing your opinion. And the irony, of course, is that one of the things that the early French Revolution pushed for was freedom of speech. And so here you have members of the radical part of the revolution saying that free speech is not necessary and in fact a danger to the revolution. So they fought for it to get it from the king, and then when they get it, they limit it to themselves and nobody else. Part of this is a push by Robespierre, particularly Robespierre, to establish what is known as a Republic of Virtue. So the idea was to create these far-reaching reforms that would rationalize France and create this Republic of Virtue. So anything related to the old France and the monarchy or the church would be removed and changed to national symbols. So names of streets are changed, for example, from St. Francis to the 14th of July. Any architecture with the fleur-de-lis, the representation symbol of the monarchy, those were smashed. Statues of religious or royal figures were destroyed. New statues of revolutionary heroes put in their place. Education was made compulsory so that all citizens, even the lowest peasant, would learn rationality and not superstition, um, and national, not regional pride. Names of regions were changed from traditional ones to something related to its geography. New national colors were set up, and everyone was supposed to wear these colors. They actually changed the French language from formal to informal. People were made to call each other citizen. When you referred to each other in the you form, in the second person, you could not use the formal. It had to be the informal, because everybody is supposed to be equal. The calendar was changed from the old system with its religious implications to nature-based names, and the system began with the start of the revolution, so they used the beginning of the revolution to begin the calendar. They tried to completely abolish Christianity and establish what was referred to as a new secular religion, the cult of reason. In order to enforce all of these things, obviously there's a lot of individuals who don't agree with this. In order to enforce these things, the Committee for Public Safety had to root out people who were opposed to this and forcibly silence them. To give you a sense of just how far the problems with the Committee for Public Safety go, is that individuals were often brought up on charges they didn't know about. They were sent to a tribunal where ultimately they did not even get to see the evidence presented against them, and they were just simply informed of the decision. Sometimes they were allowed to make a defense for themselves. Other times they simply just heard charges read against them. What's interesting, though, is how radical the terror actually gets. The Committee for Public Safety ultimately passed a law called the Law of 22-Prairial, and this is in 1794, which is actually right near the end of the terror. And basically, the Law of 22-Prairial, Prairial being the name of one of the months, essentially says that you can be tried and convicted without actual evidence being presented. So simply the accusation could be enough, that the prosecution did not need to present evidence, which of course goes contrary to all law, and in fact is even worse than the laws under the monarchy that they sought to abolish. To give you a sense of how sort of fluid the language is around it, in 1793 there was the law of suspects that was passed, saying that the purpose of the tribunals, they were aimed at those who, by their conduct, associations, comments, or writing, have shown themselves to be partisans of tyranny and enemies of liberty. But notice, I mean, not only does it say that it's how you act, it's who you associate with, anything you say or anything that you write, but notice how nebulous the terms are. Partisans of tyranny or enemies of liberty. I mean, what does that exactly mean? How is one an enemy of liberty? If you are actively fighting against the revolution, that would seem to make sense. But what if you disagree with executing the king and think he should simply be exiled? Does that make you an enemy of liberty? According to Robespierre and the rest of those within the mountain, the rest of these radical Jacobins, yes, it did make you an enemy of liberty. And it meant that you supported tyranny as well. If you questioned the war, if you questioned the draft, by any stretch of the imagination, if you said maybe we shouldn't draft people unwillingly into the army, that was considered aiding tyranny and becoming an enemy of liberty. So, what happens next? What happens is that not everybody is very pleased with what Robespierre and the Committee for Public Safety end up doing. So Robespierre and the Committee for Public Safety end up getting a little out of control. In fact, some of the numbers indicate that something along the lines of 40,000 people were killed as part of the terror, and upwards of 300,000 people were imprisoned. So you can imagine that that created a pretty big problem for them to address. Not everybody agreed with this. So, for example, there was a lot of resistance to the Committee for Public Safety and Robespierre. A lot of people had supported the revolution and the reforms to the tax code, and reducing the power of the king and nobility, lowering prices. Those all sounded great. But they saw that the radical leaders took it much further than the lower classes and even much of the middle class wanted. People wanted religious tolerance, not the abolition of religion. They didn't want to completely sever ties with tradition. They didn't think it was necessary to smash old statues and buildings, and then many of them resisted the draft. And Robespierre actually began to alienate any of his potential supporters by being so adamant in his push for complete reforming of society. To give you a sense of resistance, peasant and artisan groups in the Vendée region of France in 1793 began to fight back, especially for their right to practice religion. And this essentially ended up being a civil war for the next few years that cost anywhere, approximately cost about 250,000 lives on the rebel side. So 250,000 people die in a civil war, and much more on the Republican side. And that doesn't take into account all the rest of the warfare that's taking place. So not everybody was pleased with this. And in fact, as you've read in your textbook, some of the people who aren't pleased are members of the actual committee itself. This is what's referred to as the Thermidorian reaction, because the month of July was referred to as Thermidor. Robespierre constantly presented new lists of people to be arrested, and in fact, the lists kept getting higher and higher and higher into the new government, and ultimately Robespierre presented a new list of deputies to be arrested, deputies who were part of the Committee for Public Safety. Fearing that they were on this list, he actually was shouted down by members of the committee, who then ordered his own arrest. And rather than submit to it, he ran away to a nearby building where he tried to resist and ultimately took a pistol and shot himself in the head. But he failed at that, blowing off most of his lower jaw, where he had to languish for several days in agony. But he was obviously caught, he was arrested, and he was executed by guillotine, as you see in the image there. More moderate politicians wanted to take over and sort of rein the terror back in, but there was a vast swing to the right, and what was established ultimately in its wake was a thing known as the Directory. This was by 1797, it takes several years, but by the end of this period of the Thermidorian reaction, you have a 5-person ruling body that has both executive and legislative powers. Initially, they want to create a constitutional monarchy, but before they could do it, there's a whole series of revolts that take place by the sans-culottes. A moderate and middle-class group stages a coup, supported by Napoleon, which you'll read about later. But ultimately, the Directory takes over. But what's interesting is how they respond to the individuals involved in the terror, and they come up with their own form of response, which is known as the White Terror. And so what they do is they don't simply stop the terror, they end up going after everyone who was involved with the Committee for Public Safety. Terror on their side too. They purge any Jacobins from power, and most of them are put to death. And the party itself is actually abolished. So the idea of the Thermidorian reaction was Robespierre and the Committee for Public Safety went too far, especially in executing people. So apparently the way to solve that is to go too far and execute people, and somehow that makes it right. What are the results? Well, what happens is we look at sort of winners and losers in this system. What we'll see is that obviously the monarchy was the first and immediate loser. The monarchy is obviously a loser because the king is dead. The nobility permanently lose their privileges. The middle class actually ascended with the bourgeois revolt and the Thermidorian reaction. But the monarchy will actually return in 1815, in part because of the response of what happens with Napoleon. The urban and the rural poor were able to exercise their political power through the revolution. 25% of the land of France ends up being redistributed and made many peasants into lower middle class farm owners. But they never controlled the government thoroughly, and many of them disagreed with the very radical aspects of the terror. Long-term results are probably more important than any of the short-term gains, because the revolution showed the power of both the middle classes and the lower class, groups which had not been too active politically before, and now it showed that even if not in control, they couldn't be ignored. It also led to a form of nationalism as well, something that Louis XIV had started, trying to break the power of regionalism. Revolutionaries went a lot further than Louis XIV did with the efficiency and power of the central government. They wanted to change people's very identities. They used cultural means to get people to disassociate from an identity that was based on regions or religions to one of a secular nationality. And this idea was that it would help with unity, especially in wartime. It was also about making government more rational and efficient. And this was the start of an important trend in Europe. Other countries would also react with nationalistic approaches, especially during the time of Napoleon. And these are things, notions of nationalism, things will continue all the way up to the First World War. Finally, one unintended result is that the success of the French Revolution would inspire independence movements throughout the world, particularly in French holdings in Latin America, but also other Latin American countries as well.